Chapter 31 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
March 20th, 1824. The dreaded time is come, and Arthur is gone, as I expected. This time he announced it his intention to make but a short stay in London, and pass over to the Continent, where he should probably stay a few weeks. But I shall not expect him till after the lapse of many weeks. I now know that, with him, days signify weeks, and weeks months. July 30th. He returned about 3 weeks ago, rather better in health, certainly, than before, but still worse in temper. And yet perhaps I am wrong. It is I that am less patient and forbearing. I am tired out with his injustice, his selfishness, and hopeless depravity. I wish a milder word would do. I am no angel, and my corruption rises against it. My poor father died last week. Arthur was vexed to hear of it, because he saw that I was shocked and grieved, and he feared the circumstance would mar his comfort. When I spoke of ordering my mourning, he exclaimed,
"Oh, I hate black. But however, I suppose you must wear it a while, for form's sake. But I hope, Helen, you won't think it your bounden duty to compose your face and manners into conformity with your funeral garb. Why should you sigh and groan, and I be made uncomfortable because an old gentleman in shire, a perfect stranger to us both, has thought proper to drink himself to death? There now, I declare you're crying. Well, it must be affection."
He would not hear of my attending the funeral, or going for a day or two, to cheer poor Frederick's solitude. It was quite unnecessary, he said, and I was unreasonable to wish it. What was my father to me? I had never seen him but once since I was a baby, and I well knew he had never cared a stiver about me, and my brother, too, was little better than a stranger.
"Besides, dear Helen,"
said he, embracing me with flattering fondness,
"I cannot spare you for a single day."
"Then how have you managed without me these many days?" said I.
"Ah, then I was knocking about the world. Now I am at home, and home without you, my household deity, would be intolerable."
"Yes, as long as I am necessary to your comfort. But you did not say so before, when you urged me to leave you, in order that you might get away from your home without me," retorted I. But before the words were well out of my mouth, I regretted having uttered them. It seemed so heavy a charge. If false, too gross an insult; if true, too humiliating a fact to be thus openly cast in his teeth. But I might have spared myself that momentary pang of self-reproach. The accusation awoke neither shame nor indignation in him. He attempted neither denial nor excuse, but only answered with a long, low, chuckling laugh, as if he viewed the whole transaction as a clever, merry jest, from beginning to end. "Surely that man will make me dislike him at last. Syne as ye brew, my maiden fair, keep mind that ye maun drink the yill. Yes, and I will drink it to the very dregs, and none but myself shall know how bitter I find it." August 20th. We are shaken down again to about our usual position. Arthur has returned to nearly his former condition and habits, and I have found it my wisest plan to shut my eyes against the past and future, as far as he at least is concerned, and live only for the present; to love him when I can, to smile, if possible, when he smiles; be cheerful when he is cheerful, and pleased when he is agreeable; and when he is not, to try to make him so; and if that won't answer, to bear with him, to excuse him, and forgive him as well as I can, and restrain my own evil passions from aggravating his; and yet, while I thus yield and minister to his more harmless propensities to self-indulgence, to do all in my power to save him from the worse. But we shall not be long alone together. I shall shortly be called upon to entertain the same select body of friends as we had the autumn before last, with the addition of Mr. Hattersley, and, at my special request, his wife and child. I long to see Millicent, and her little girl too. The latter is now above a year old. She will be a charming playmate for my little Arthur. September 30th. Our guests have been here a week or two, but I have had no leisure to pass any comments upon them till now. I cannot get over my dislike to Lady Loughborough. It is not founded on mere personal pique. It is the woman herself that I dislike, because I so thoroughly disapprove of her. I always avoid her company as much as I can without violating the laws of hospitality. But when we do speak or converse together, it is with the utmost civility, even apparent cordiality on her part. But preserve me from such cordiality. It is like handling briar roses and may blossoms, bright enough to the eye, and outwardly soft to the touch, but you know there are thorns beneath, and every now and then you feel them too, and perhaps resent the injury by crushing them in till you've destroyed their power, though somewhat to the detriment of your own fingers. Of late, however, I have seen nothing in her conduct towards Arthur to anger or alarm me. During the first few days I thought she seemed very solicitous to win his admiration. Her efforts were not unnoticed by him. I frequently saw him smiling to himself at her artful manoeuvres, but, to his praise be it spoken, her shafts fell powerless by his side. Her most bewitching smiles, her haughtiest frowns were ever received with the same immutable, careless good humour, till, finding he was indeed impenetrable, she suddenly remitted her efforts, and became, to all appearance, as perfectly indifferent as himself. Nor have I since witnessed any symptom of pique on his part, or renewed attempts at conquest upon hers. This is as it should be, but Arthur never will let me be satisfied with him. I have never, for a single hour since I married him, known what it is to realise that sweet idea, in quietness and confidence shall be your rest. Those two detestable men, Grimsby and Hattersley, have destroyed all my labour against his love of wine. They encourage him daily to overstep the bounds of moderation, and not unfrequently to disgrace himself by positive excess. I shall not soon forget the second night after their arrival. Just as I had retired from the dining-room with the ladies, before the door was closed upon us, Arthur exclaimed,
"Now then, my lads, what say you to a regular jollification?"
Millicent glanced at me with a half-reproachful look, as if I could hinder it, but her countenance changed when she heard Hattersley's voice shouting through door and wall,
"I'm your man! Send for more wine! Here isn't half enough!"
We had scarcely entered the drawing-room before we were joined by Lord Loughborough.
"What can induce you to come so soon?"
exclaimed his lady, with a most ungracious air of dissatisfaction.
"You know I never drink, Annabella,"
replied he seriously.
"Well, but you might stay with them a little. It looks so silly to be always dangling after the women. I wonder you can."
He reproached her with a look of mingled bitterness and surprise, and sinking into a chair, suppressed a heavy sigh, bit his pale lips, and fixed his eyes upon the floor. "You did right to leave them, Lord Loughborough," said I. "I trust you will always continue to honour us so early with your company. And if Annabella knew the value of true wisdom, and the misery of folly, and intemperance, she would not talk such nonsense, even in jest." He raised his eyes while I spoke, and gravely turned them upon me, with a half-surprised, half-abstracted look, and then bent them on his wife.
"At least,"
said she,
"I know the value of a warm heart and a bold manly spirit."
"Well, Annabella,"
said he, in a deep and hollow tone,
"since my presence is disagreeable to you, I will relieve you of it."
"Are you going back to them, then?"
said she carelessly.
"No,"
exclaimed he, with harsh and startling emphasis.
"I will not go back to them, and I will never stay with them one moment longer than I think right, for you or any other tempter. But you needn't mind that. I shall never trouble you again by intruding my company upon you so unseasonably."
He left the room. I heard the hall door open and shut, and immediately after, on putting aside the curtain, I saw him pacing down the park, in the comfortless gloom of the damp, cloudy twilight. "It would serve you right, Annabella," said I, at length, "if Lord Loughborough were to return to his old habits, which had so nearly effected his ruin, and which it cost him such an effort to break. You would then see cause to repent such conduct as this."
"Not at all, my dear. I should not mind if his lordship were to see fit to intoxicate himself every day. I should only the sooner be rid of him."
"Oh, Annabella!"
cried Millicent.
"How can you say such wicked things? It would indeed be a just punishment, as far as you are concerned, if Providence should take you at your word, and make you feel what others feel, that—"
She paused as a sudden burst of loud talking and laughter reached us from the dining-room, in which the voice of Hattersley was preeminently conspicuous, even to my unpractised ear.
"What you feel at this moment, I suppose?"
said Lady Loughborough, with a malicious smile, fixing her eyes upon her cousin's distressed countenance. The latter offered no reply, but averted her face and brushed away a tear. At that moment the door opened, and admitted Mr. Hargrave, just a little flushed, his dark eyes sparkling with unwonted vivacity.
"Oh, I'm so glad you're come, Walter,"
cried his sister.
"But I wish you could have got Ralph to come too."
"Utterly impossible, dear Millicent,"
replied he gaily.
"I had much ado to get away myself. Ralph attempted to keep me by violence. Huntingdon threatened me with the eternal loss of his friendship, and Grimsby, worse than all, endeavoured to make me ashamed of my virtue, by such galling sarcasms and innuendoes as he knew would wound me the most. So you see, ladies, you ought to make me welcome, when I have braved and suffered so much for the favour of your sweet society.
He smilingly turned to me and bowed as he finished the sentence.
Isn't he handsome now, Helen?
Whispered Millicent, her sisterly pride overcoming, for the moment, all other considerations. He would be, I returned, if that brilliance of eye and lip and cheek were natural to him. But look again, a few hours hence. Here the gentleman took a seat near me at the table, and petitioned for a cup of coffee.
I consider this an apt illustration of heaven taken by storm,
said he, as I handed one to him.
I am in paradise now, but I have fought my way through flood and fire to win it. Ralph Hattersley's last resource was to set his back against the door, and swear I should find no passage but through his body, a pretty substantial one too. Happily, however, that was not the only door, and I effected my escape by the side entrance through the butler's pantry, to the infinite amazement of Benson, who was cleaning the plate.
Mr. Hargrave laughed, and so did his cousin, but his sister and I remained silent and grave.
Pardon my levity, Mrs. Huntingdon,
murmured he, more seriously, as he raised his eyes to my face.
You are not used to these things. You suffer them to affect your delicate mind too sensibly. But I thought of you in the midst of those lawless roisterers, and I endeavoured to persuade Mr. Huntingdon to think of you too, but to no purpose. I fear he is fully determined to enjoy himself this night, and it will be no use keeping the coffee waiting for him or his companions. It will be much if they join us at tea. Meantime, I earnestly wish I could banish the thoughts of them from your mind, and my own too, for I hate to think of them, yes, even of my dear friend Huntingdon, when I consider the power he possesses over the happiness of one so immeasurably superior to himself, and the use he makes of it. I positively detest the man.
You had better not say so to me, then, said I, for, bad as he is part of myself, and you cannot abuse him without offending me.
Pardon me, then, for I would sooner die than offend you. But let us say no more of him for the present, if you please.
At last they came, but not till after 10, when tea, which had been delayed for more than half an hour, was nearly over. Much as I had longed for their coming, my heart failed me at the riotous uproar of their approach, and Millicent turned pale, and almost started from her seat, as Mr. Hattersley burst into the room, with a clamorous volley of oaths in his mouth, which Hargrave endeavoured to check by entreating him to remember the ladies.
Ah! You do well to remind me of the ladies, you dastardly deserter!
Cried he, shaking his formidable fist at his brother-in-law.
If it were not for them, you well know I'd demolish you in the twinkling of an eye, and give your body to the fowls of heaven and the lilies of the fields.
Then, planting a chair by Lady Loughborough's side, he stationed himself in it, and began to talk to her with a mixture of absurdity and impudence that seemed rather to amuse than to offend her, though she affected to resent his insolence, and to keep him at bay with sallies of smart and spirited repartee. Meantime, Mr. Grimsby seated himself by me, in the chair vacated by Hargrave as they entered, and gravely stated that he would thank me for a cup of tea, and Arthur placed himself beside poor Millicent, confidentially pushing his head into her face, and drawing in closer to her as she shrank away from him. He was not so noisy as Hattersley, but his face was exceedingly flushed. He laughed incessantly, and while I blushed for all I saw and heard of him, I was glad that he chose to talk to his companion in so low a tone that no one could hear what he said but herself.
"Oh, what fools they are!"
drawled Mr. Grimsby, who had been talking away at my elbow, with sententious gravity all the time. But I had been too much absorbed in contemplating the deplorable state of the other two, especially Arthur, to attend to him.
"Did you ever hear such nonsense as they talk, Mrs. Huntingdon?"
he continued.
"Oh, I'm quite ashamed of them, for my part. They can't take so much as a bottle between them without its getting into their heads."
You are pouring the cream into your saucer, Mr. Grimsby.
"Ah, yes. I see. But we're almost in darkness here. Hargrave, snuff those candles, will you?"
"They're wax. They don't require snuffing," said I.
The light of the body is the eye,
observed Hargrave, with a sarcastic smile.
If thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light.
Grimsby repulsed him with a solemn wave of the hand, and then turning to me, continued, with the same drawling tones and strange uncertainty of utterance and heavy gravity of aspect as before.
But as I was saying, Mrs. Huntingdon, they have no head at all. They can't take half a bottle without being affected some way. Whereas well, I've taken 3 times as much as they have tonight, and you see, I am perfectly steady. Now that may strike you as very singular, but I think I can explain it. You see, their brains. I mention no names, but you'll understand to whom I allude. Their brains are light to begin with, and the fumes of the fermented liquor render them lighter still, and produce an entire lightheadedness or giddiness, resulting in intoxication, whereas my brains, being composed of more solid materials, will absorb a considerable quantity of this alcoholic vapour without the production of any sensible result.
I think you will find a sensible result produced on that tea,
interrupted Mr. Hargrave,
by the quantity of sugar you have put into it. Instead of your usual complement of 1 lump, you have put in 6.
Have I so?
replied the philosopher, diving with his spoon into the cup, and bringing up several half-dissolved pieces in confirmation of the assertion.
I perceive. Thus, madame, you see the evil of absence of mind, of thinking too much while engaged in the common concerns of life. Now, if I had had my wits about me, like ordinary men, instead of within me, like a philosopher, I should not have spoiled this cup of tea, and been constrained to trouble you for another.
That is the sugar-basin, Mr. Grimsby. Now you have spoiled the sugar too, and I'll thank you to ring for some more, for here is Lord Loughborough at last, and I hope his lordship will condescend to sit down with us, such as we are, and allow me to give him some tea. His lordship gravely bowed in answer to my appeal, but said nothing. Meantime, Hargrave volunteered to ring for the sugar, while Grimsby lamented his mistake, and attempted to prove that it was owing to the shadow of the urn and the badness of the lights. Lord Loughborough had entered a minute or two before, unobserved by any one but me, and had been standing before the door, grimly surveying the company. He now stepped up to Annabella, who sat with her back towards him, with Hattersley still beside her, though not now attending to her, being occupied in vociferously abusing and bullying his host.
"Well, Annabella,"
said her husband, as he leant over the back of her chair,
"which of these 3 bold manly spirits would you have me to resemble?"
By heaven and earth, you shall resemble us all!
cried Hattersley, starting up and rudely seizing him by the arm.
Hallo, Huntingdon!
He shouted.
I've got him! Come, man, and help me! And damn me if I don't make him drunk before I let him go. He shall make up for all past delinquencies, as sure as I'm a living soul.
There followed a disgraceful contest. Lord Loughborough, in desperate earnest, and pale with anger, silently struggling to release himself from the powerful madman that was striving to drag him from the room. I attempted to urge Arthur to interfere in behalf of his outraged guest, but he could do nothing but laugh.
Huntingdon, you fool! Come and help me, can't you?
cried Hattersley, himself somewhat weakened by his excesses.
I'm wishing you Godspeed, Hattersley,
cried Arthur,
and aiding you with my prayers. I can't do anything else if my life depended on it. I'm quite used up. Oh!
And leaning back in his seat, he clapped his hands on his sides and groaned aloud.
"Annabella, give me a candle,"
said Loughborough, whose antagonist had now got him round the waist and was endeavouring to root him from the door-post, to which he madly clung with all the energy of desperation.
"I shall take no part in your rude sports,"
replied the lady coldly, drawing back.
"I wonder you can expect it."
But I snatched up a candle and brought it to him. He took it, and held the flame to Hattersley's hands, till, roaring like a wild beast, the latter unclasped them, and let him go. He vanished, I suppose to his own apartment, for nothing more was seen of him till the morning. Swearing and cursing like a maniac, Hattersley threw himself on to the ottoman beside the window. The door being now free, Millicent attempted to make her escape from the scene of her husband's disgrace, but he called her back, and insisted upon her coming to him.
What do you want, Ralph?
Murmured she, reluctantly approaching him.
I want to know what's the matter with you,
said he, pulling her on to his knee like a child.
What are you crying for, Millicent? Tell me.
I'm not crying.
You are,
persisted he, rudely pulling her hands from her face.
How dare you tell such a lie?
I'm not crying now,
pleaded she.
But you have been, and just this minute too, and I will know what for. Come now, you shall tell me.
Do let me alone, Ralph. Remember, we are not at home.
No matter, you shall answer my question,
exclaimed her tormentor, and he attempted to extort the confession by shaking her, and remorselessly crushing her slight arms in the grip of his powerful fingers. Don't let him treat your sister in that way, said I to Mr. Hargrave.
Come now, Hattersley, I can't allow that,
said that gentleman, stepping up to the ill-assorted couple.
Let my sister alone, if you please.
And he made an effort to unclasp the ruffian's fingers from her arm, but was suddenly driven backward, and nearly laid upon the floor by a violent blow on the chest, accompanied with the admonition,
Take that for your insolence, and learn to interfere between me and mine again.
If you were not drunk, I'd have satisfaction for that,
gasped Hargrave, white and breathless, as much from passion as from the immediate effects of the blow.
Go to the devil,
responded his brother-in-law.
Now, Millicent, tell me what you were crying for.
I'll tell you some other time,
murmured she.
When we are alone.
Tell me now,
said he, with another shake and a squeeze that made her draw in her breath and bite her lip to suppress a cry of pain. I'll tell you, Mr. Hattersley, said I. She was crying from pure shame and humiliation for you, because she could not bear to see you conduct yourself so disgracefully.
Confound you, madam,
muttered he, with a stare of stupid amazement at my impudence.
It was not that, was it, Millicent?
She was silent.
Come, speak up, child.
I can't tell now,
sobbed she.
But you can say yes or no as well as I can't tell. Come.
Yes,
she whispered, hanging her head and blushing at the awful acknowledgment.
Curse you for an impertinent hussy, then,
cried he, throwing her from him with such violence that she fell on her side, but she was up again before either I or her brother could come to her assistance, and made the best of her way out of the room, and, I suppose, upstairs, without loss of time. The next object of assault was Arthur, who sat opposite, and had, no doubt, richly enjoyed the whole scene.
Now, Huntingdon,
exclaimed his irascible friend,
I will not have you sitting there and laughing like an idiot.
Oh, Hattersley,
cried he, wiping his swimming eyes.
He'll be the death of me.
Yes, I will, but not as you suppose. I'll have the heart out of your body, man, if you irritate me with any more of that imbecile laughter. What, are you at it yet? There, see if that'll settle you,
cried Hattersley, snatching up a footstool, and hurtling it at the head of his host, but he as well as missed his aim, and the latter still sat collapsed and quaking with feeble laughter, with tears running down his face, a deplorable spectacle indeed. Hattersley tried cursing and swearing, but it would not do. He then took a number of books from the table beside him, and threw them, one by one, at the object of his wrath. But Arthur only laughed the more, and finally Hattersley rushed upon him in a frenzy, and seizing him by the shoulders, gave him a violent shaking, under which he laughed and shrieked alarmingly. But I saw no more. I thought I had witnessed enough of my husband's degradation, and leaving Annabella and the rest to follow when they pleased, I withdrew, but not to bed. Dismissing Rachel to her rest, I walked up and down my room, in an agony of misery for what had been done, and suspense, not knowing what might further happen, or how or when that unhappy creature would come up to bed. At last he came, slowly and stumblingly, ascending the stairs, supported by Grimsby and Hattersley, who neither of them walked quite steadily themselves, but were both laughing and joking at him, and making noise enough for all the servants to hear. He himself was no longer laughing now, but sick and stupid. I will write no more about that. Such disgraceful scenes, or nearly such, have been repeated more than once. I don't say much to Arthur about it, for if I did, it would do more harm than good. But I let him know that I intensely dislike such exhibitions, and each time he has promised they should never again be repeated. But I fear he is losing the little self-command and self-respect he once possessed. Formerly he would have been ashamed to act thus, at least before any other witnesses than his boon companions, or such as they. His friend Hargrave, with a prudence and self-government that I envy for him, never disgraces himself by taking more than sufficient to render him a little elevated, and is always the first to leave the table after Lord Loughborough, who, wiser still, perseveres in vacating the dining-room immediately after us, but never once, since Annabella offended him so deeply, has he entered the drawing-room before the rest, always spending the interim in the library, which I take care to have lighted for his accommodation, or, on fine moonlight nights, in roaming about the grounds. But I think she regrets her misconduct, for she has never repeated it since, and of late she has comported herself with wonderful propriety towards him, treating him with more uniform kindness and consideration than ever I have observed her to do before. I date the time of this improvement from the period when she ceased to hope and strive for Arthur's admiration.
End of chapter 31. Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
October 5th. Esther Hargrave is getting a fine girl. She is not out of the schoolroom yet, but her mother frequently brings her over to call in the mornings when the gentlemen are out, and sometimes she spends an hour or two in company with her sister and me, and the children, and when we go to the Grove, I always contrive to see her, and talk more to her than to any one else, for I am very much attached to my little friend, and so is she to me. I wonder what she can see to like in me, though, for I am no longer the happy, lively girl I used to be. But she has no other society, save that of her uncongenial mother and her governess, as artificial and conventional a person as that prudent mother could procure to rectify the pupil's natural qualities, and now and then her subdued, quiet sister. I often wonder what will be her lot in life, and so does she, but her speculations on the future are full of buoyant hope. So were mine once. I shudder to think of her being awakened, like me, to a sense of their delusive vanity. It seems as if I should feel her disappointment even more deeply than my own. I feel almost as if I were born for such a fate, but she is so joyous and fresh, so light of heart and free of spirit, and so guileless and unsuspecting too. Oh, it would be cruel to make her feel as I feel now, and know what I have known. Her sister trembles for her too. Yesterday morning, one of October's brightest, loveliest days, Millicent and I were in the garden, enjoying a brief half-hour together with our children, while Annabella was lying on the drawing-room sofa, deep in the last new novel. We had been romping with the little creatures, almost as merry and wild as themselves, and now paused in the shade of the tall copper beech, to recover breath and rectify our hair, disordered by the rough play and the frolicsome breeze, while they toddled together along the broad sunny walk, my Arthur supporting the feebler steps of her little Helen, and sagaciously pointing out to her the brightest beauties of the border as they passed, with semi-articulate prattle, that did as well for her as any other mode of discourse. From laughing at the pretty sight, we began to talk of the children's future life, and that made us thoughtful. We both relapsed into silent musing as we slowly proceeded up the walk, and I suppose Millicent, by a train of associations, was led to think of her sister.
"Helen,"
said she,
"you often see Esther, don't you?"
"Not very often."
"But you have more frequent opportunities of meeting her than I have, and she loves you, I know, and reverences you too. There is nobody's opinion she thinks so much of, and she says you have more sense than mamma."
"That is because she is self-willed, and my opinions more generally coincide with her own than your mamma's. But what then, Millicent?"
"Well, since you have so much influence with her, I wish you would seriously impress it upon her, never, on any account, or for anybody's persuasion, to marry for the sake of money, or rank, or establishment, or any earthly thing, but true affection and well-grounded esteem."
"There is no necessity for that," said I, "for we have had some discourse on that subject already, and I assure you her ideas of love and matrimony are as romantic as any one could desire."
"But romantic notions will not do. I want her to have true notions."
"Very right. But in my judgment, what the world stigmatizes as romantic is often more nearly allied to the truth than is commonly supposed. For, if the generous ideas of youth are too often overclouded by the sordid views of after life, that scarcely proves them to be false."
"Well, but if you think her ideas are what they ought to be, strengthen them, will you? And confirm them, as far as you can, for I had romantic notions once, and I don't mean to say that I regret my lot, for I'm quite sure I don't, but—"
"I understand you," said I. "You are contented for yourself, but you would not have your sister to suffer the same as you."
"No, or worse. She might have far worse to suffer than I, for I am really contented, Helen, though you mayn't think it. I speak the solemn truth in saying that I would not exchange my husband for any man on earth, if I might do it by the plucking of this leaf."
"Well, I believe you. Now that you have him, You would not exchange him for another, but then you would gladly exchange some of his qualities for those of better men.
Yes, just as I would gladly exchange some of my own qualities for those of better women, for neither he nor I are perfect, and I desire this improvement as earnestly as my own. And he will improve, don't you think so, Helen? He's only 26 yet."
"He may," I answered.
"He will, he will,"
repeated she. "Excuse the faintness of my acquiescence, Millicent. I would not discourage your hopes for the world, but mine have been so often disappointed, that I am become as cold and doubtful in my expectations as the flattest of octogenarians."
"And yet you do hope still, even for Mr. Huntingdon?"
"I do, I confess, even for him, for it seems as if life and hope must cease together. And is he so much worse, Millicent, than Mr. Hattersley?"
"Well, to give you my candid opinion, I think there is no comparison between them. But you mustn't be offended, Helen, for you know I always speak my mind, and you may speak yours too. I shan't care."
"I am not offended, love, and my opinion is, that if there be a comparison made between the two, the difference, for the most part, is certainly in Hattersley's favour." Millicent's own heart told her how much it cost me to make this acknowledgment, and with a childlike impulse she expressed her sympathy by suddenly kissing my cheek, without a word of reply, and then turning quickly away, caught up her baby, and hid her face in its frock. How odd is it that we so often weep for each other's distresses, when we shed not a tear for our own! Her heart had been full enough of her own sorrows, but it overflowed at the idea of mine, and I too shed tears at the sight of her sympathetic emotion, though I had not wept for myself for many a week. It was one rainy day last week. Most of the company were killing time in the billiard-room, but Millicent and I were with little Arthur and Helen in the library, and between our books, our children, and each other, we expected to make out a very agreeable morning. We had not been thus secluded above 2 hours, however, when Mr. Hattersley came in, attracted, I suppose, by the voice of his child, as he was crossing the hall, for he is prodigiously fond of her, and she of him. He was redolent of the stables, where he had been regaling himself with the company of his fellow creatures, the horses, ever since breakfast. But that was no matter to my little namesake. As soon as the colossal person of her father darkened the door, she uttered a shrill scream of delight, and quitting her mother's side, ran crowing towards him, balancing her course with outstretched arms, and embracing his knee, threw back her head, and laughed in his face. He might well look smilingly down upon those small fair features, radiant with innocent mirth, those clear blue shining eyes, and that soft flaxen hair cast back upon the little ivory neck and shoulders. Did he not think how unworthy he was of such a possession? I fear no such idea crossed his mind. He caught her up, and there followed some minutes of very rough play, during which it is difficult to say whether the father or the daughter laughed and shouted the loudest. At length, however, the boisterous pastime terminated, suddenly, as might be expected. The little one was hurt and began to cry, and the ungentle playfellow tossed it into its mother's lap, bidding her
"Make all straight."
As happy to return to that gentle comforter as it had been to leave her, the child nestled in her arms, and hushed its cries in a moment, and sinking its little weary head on her bosom, soon dropped asleep. Meantime, Mr. Hattersley strode up to the fire, and interposing his height and breadth between us and it, stood with arms akimbo, expanding his chest, and gazing round him, as if the house and all its appurtenances and contents were his own undisputed possessions.
"Deuced bad weather, this,"
he began.
"There'll be no shooting today, I guess."
Then, suddenly lifting up his voice, he regaled us with a few bars of a rollicking song, which abruptly ceasing, he finished the tune with a whistle, and then continued,
"I say, Mrs. Huntingdon, what a fine stud your husband has. Not large, but good. I've been looking at them a bit this morning, and upon my word, Black Boss, and Grey Tom, and that young Nimrod, are the finest animals I've seen for many a day."
Then followed a particular discussion of their various merits, succeeded by a sketch of the great things he intended to do in the horse-jockey line, when his old governor thought proper to quit the stage.
"Not that I wish him to close his accounts,"
added he.
"The old Trojan is welcome to keep his books open as long as he pleases for me."
I hope so indeed, Mr. Hattersley.
"Oh, yes. It's only my way of talking. The event must come some time, and so I look to the bright side of it. That's the right plan, isn't it, Mrs. H? What are you two doing here? By the by, where's Lady Lawborough?"
In the billiard-room.
"What a splendid creature she is,"
continued he, fixing his eyes on his wife, who changed colour, and looked more and more disconcerted as he proceeded.
"What a noble figure she has, and what magnificent black eyes, and what a fine spirit of her own, and what a tongue of her own, too, when she likes to use it. I perfectly adore her. But never mind, Millicent. I wouldn't have her for my wife, not if she'd a kingdom for her dowry. I'm better satisfied with the one I have. Now then, what do you look so sulky for? Don't you believe me?
Yes, I believe you,
murmured she, in a tone of half sad, half sullen resignation, as she turned away to stroke the hair of her sleeping infant that she had laid on the sofa beside her.
Well then, what makes you so cross? Come here, Milly, and tell me why you can't be satisfied with my assurance.
She went, and putting her little hand within his arm, looked up in his face, and said softly,
"What does it amount to, Ralph? Only to this, that though you admire Annabella so much, and for qualities that I don't possess, you would still rather have me than her for your wife, which merely proves that you don't think it necessary to love your wife. You are satisfied if she can keep your house and take care of your child. But I'm not cross. I'm only sorry for—"
added she, in a low tremulous accent, withdrawing her hand from his arm, and bending her looks on the rug.
"If you don't love me, you don't, and it can't be helped."
Very true. But who told you I didn't? Did I say I loved Annabella?
You said you adored her.
True, but adoration isn't love. I adore Annabella, but I don't love her. And I love thee, Millicent, but I don't adore thee.
In proof of his affection, he clutched a handful of her light brown ringlets, and appeared to twist them unmercifully.
"Do you really, Ralph?"
murmured she, with a faint smile beaming through her tears, just putting up her hand to his, in token that he pulled rather too hard.
To be sure I do,
responded he.
Only you bother me rather sometimes.
"I bother you?"
cried she, in very natural surprise.
Yes, you. But only by your exceeding goodness. When a boy has been eating raisins and sugar plums all day, he longs for a squeeze of sour orange by way of a change. And did you never, Milly, observe the sands on the seashore? How nice and smooth they look, and how soft and easy they feel to the foot. But if you plod along for half an hour over this soft, easy carpet, giving way at every step, yielding the more the harder you press, you'll find it rather wearisome work, and be glad enough to come to a bit of good firm rock, that won't budge an inch whether you stand, walk, or stamp upon it. And though it be hard as the nether millstone, you'll find it the easier footing after all."
"I know what you mean, Ralph,"
said she, nervously playing with her watch-guard, and tracing the figure on the rug with the point of her tiny foot.
"I know what you mean, but I thought you always liked to be yielded to, and I can't alter now."
"I do like it,"
replied he, bringing her to him by another tug at her hair.
"You mustn't mind my talk, Milly. A man must have something to grumble about, and if he can't complain that his wife harries him to death with her perversity and ill-humour, he must complain that she wears him out with her kindness and gentleness."
"But why complain at all, unless because you are tired and dissatisfied?"
"To excuse my own failings, to be sure. Do you think I'll bear all the burden of my sins on my own shoulders, as long as there's another ready to help me, with none of her own to carry?"
"There is no such one on earth,"
said she seriously, and then, taking his hand from her head, she kissed it with an air of genuine devotion, and tripped away to the door.
"What now?" said
he.
"Where are you going?"
"To tidy my hair,"
she answered, smiling through her disordered locks.
"You've made it all come down."
"Off with you, then. An excellent little woman,"
he remarked when she was gone.
"but a thought too soft. She almost melts in one's hands. I positively think I ill-use her sometimes, when I've taken too much. But I can't help it, for she never complains, either at the time or after. I suppose she doesn't mind it."
"I can enlighten you on that subject, Mr. Hattersley," said I. "She does mind it, and some other things she minds still more, which yet you may never hear her complain of."
"How do you know? Does she complain to you?"
demanded he, with a sudden spark of fury, ready to burst into a flame if I should answer yes. "No," I replied, "but I have known her longer and studied her more closely than you have done, and I can tell you, Mr. Hattersley, that Millicent loves you more than you deserve, and that you have it in your power to make her very happy, instead of which you are her evil genius, and, I will venture to say, there is not a single day passes in which you do not inflict upon her some pang that you might spare her if you would."
"Well, it's not my fault,"
said he, gazing carelessly up at the ceiling, and plunging his hands into his pockets.
"If my own goings don't suit her, she should tell me so."
"Is she not exactly the wife you wanted? Did you not tell Mr. Huntingdon you must have one that would submit to anything without a murmur, and never blame you, whatever you did?"
"True, but we shouldn't always have what we want. It spoils the best of us, doesn't it? How can I help playing the deuce when I see it's all one to her whether I behave like a Christian or like a scoundrel such as nature made me? And how can I help teasing her when she's so invitingly meek and mim, when she lies down like a spaniel at my feet, and never so much as squeaks to tell me that's enough?
If you are a tyrant by nature, the temptation is strong, I allow. But no generous mind delights to oppress the weak, but rather to cherish and protect.
I don't oppress her, but it's so confounded flat to be always cherishing and protecting. And then, how can I tell that I am oppressing her when she melts away and makes no sign? I sometimes think she has no feeling at all. And then I go on till she cries, and that satisfies me.
Then you do delight to oppress her?
I don't, I tell you. Only when I'm in a bad humour, or a particularly good one, and want to afflict for the pleasure of comforting, or when she looks flat and wants shaking up a bit. And sometimes she provokes me by crying for nothing, and won't tell me what it's for. And then, I allow, it enrages me past bearing, especially when I'm not my own man.
As is no doubt generally the case on such occasions, said I. But in future, Mr. Hattersley, when you see her looking flat, or crying for nothing, as you call it, ascribe it all to yourself. Be assured it is something you have done amiss, or your general misconduct, that distresses her.
I don't believe it. If it were, she should tell me so. I don't like that way of moping and fretting in silence and saying nothing. It's not honest. How can she expect me to mend my ways at that rate?
Perhaps she gives you credit for having more sense than you possess, and deludes herself with the hope that you will one day see your own errors and repair them, if left to your own reflection.
None of your sneers, Mrs. Huntingdon. I have the sense to see that I'm not always quite correct, but sometimes I think that's no great matter, as long as I injure nobody but myself.
It is a great matter, interrupted I, both to yourself, as you will hereafter find to your cost, and to all connected with you, most especially your wife. But indeed it is nonsense to talk about injuring no one but yourself. It is impossible to injure yourself, especially by such acts as we allude to, without injuring hundreds, if not thousands, besides, in a greater or less degree, either by the evil you do or the good you leave undone.
And as I was saying,
continued he,
or would have said if you hadn't taken me up so short, I sometimes think I should do better if I were joined to one that would always remind me when I was wrong, and give me a motive for doing good and eschewing evil, by decidedly showing her approval of the one and disapproval of the other.
If you had no higher motive than the approval of your fellow mortal, it would do you little good.
Well, but if I had a mate that would not always be yielding, and always equally kind, but that would have the spirit to stand at bay now and then, and honestly tell me her mind at all times, such a one as yourself, for instance. Now, if I went on with you as I do with her when I'm in London, you'd make the house too hot to hold me at times, I'll be sworn.
You mistake me. I'm no termagant.
Well, all the better for that, for I can't stand contradiction, in a general way, and I'm as fond of my own will as another. Only I think too much of it doesn't answer for any man.
Well, I would never contradict you without a cause, but certainly I would always let you know what I thought of your conduct, and if you oppressed me, in body, mind, or estate, you should at least have no reason to suppose I didn't mind it.
I know that, my lady, and I think if my little wife were to follow the same plan, it would be better for us both.
I'll tell her.
No, no, let her be. There's much to be said on both sides, and now I think upon it, Huntingdon often regrets that you are not more like her, scoundrelly dog that he is. And you see, after all, you can't reform him. He's 10 times worse than I. He's afraid of you, to be sure. That is, he's always on his best behaviour in your presence. But
I wonder what his worst behaviour is like, then. I could not forbear observing.
Why, to tell you the truth, it's very bad indeed. Isn't it, Hargrave?
Said he, addressing that gentleman, who had entered the room unperceived by me, for I was now standing near the fire, with my back to the door.
Isn't Huntingdon,
he continued,
as great a reprobate as ever was damned?
His lady will not hear him censured with impunity,
replied Mr. Hargrave, coming forward.
But I must say, I thank God I am not such another.
Perhaps it would become you better, said I, to look at what you are, and say, God be merciful to me, a sinner.
You are severe,
returned he, bowing slightly, and drawing himself up with a proud yet injured air. Hattersley laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. Moving from under his hand with a gesture of insulted dignity, Mr. Hargrave took himself away to the other end of the rug.
Isn't it a shame, Mrs. Huntingdon?
cried his brother-in-law.
I struck Walter Hargrave when I was drunk, the second night after we came, and he's turned a cold shoulder on me ever since, though I asked his pardon the very morning after it was done.
Your manner of asking it,
returned the other,
and the clearness with which you remembered the whole transaction, showed you were not too drunk to be fully conscious of what you were about, and quite responsible for the deed.
You wanted to interfere between me and my wife,
grumbled Hattersley.
and that is enough to provoke any man.
You justify it, then?
Said his opponent, darting upon him a most vindictive glance.
No, I tell you I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been under excitement. And if you choose to bear malice for it after all the handsome things I've said, do so and be damned.
I would refrain from such language in a lady's presence, at least,
said Mr. Hargrave, hiding his anger under a mask of disgust.
What have I said?
Returned Hattersley.
Nothing but heaven's truth. He will be damned, won't he, Mrs. Huntingdon, if he doesn't forgive his brother's trespasses?
You ought to forgive him, Mr. Hargrave, since he asks you, said I.
Do you say so? Then I will.
And, smiling almost frankly, he stepped forward and offered his hand. It was immediately clasped in that of his relative, and the reconciliation was apparently cordial on both sides.
The affront,
continued Hargrave, turning to me,
owed half its bitterness to the fact of its being offered in your presence, and since you bid me forgive it, I will, and forget it too.
I guess the best return I can make will be to take myself off,
muttered Hattersley, with a broad grin. His companion smiled, and he left the room. This put me on my guard. Mr. Hargrave turned seriously to me, and earnestly began.
Dear Mrs. Huntingdon, how I have longed for, yet dreaded this hour. Do not be alarmed,
he added, for my face was crimson with anger.
I am not about to offend you with any useless entreaties or complaints. I am not going to presume to trouble you with the mention of my own feelings, or your perfections. But I have something to reveal to you which you ought to know, and which, yet, it pains me inexpressibly.
Then don't trouble yourself to reveal it.
But it is of importance.
If so, I shall hear it soon enough, especially if it is bad news, as you seem to consider it. At present I am going to take the children to the nursery.
But can't you ring and send them?
No, I want the exercise of a run to the top of the house. Come, Arthur.
But you will return?
Not yet. Don't wait.
Then when may I see you again?
At lunch, said I, departing with little Helen in one arm, and leading Arthur by the hand. He turned away, muttering some sentence of impatient censure or complaint, in which heartless was the only distinguishable word. What nonsense is this, Mr. Hargrave? Said I, pausing in the doorway. What do you mean?
Oh, nothing. I did not intend you should hear my soliloquy. But the fact is, Mrs. Huntingdon, I have a disclosure to make, painful for me to offer as for you to hear, and I want you to give me a few minutes of your attention in private at any time and place you like to appoint. It is from no selfish motive that I ask it, and not for any cause that could alarm your superhuman purity. Therefore you need not kill me with that look of cold and pitiless disdain. I know too well the feelings with which the bearers of bad tidings are commonly regarded not to.
What is this wonderful piece of intelligence? Said I, impatiently interrupting him. If it is anything of real importance, speak it in 3 words before I go.
In 3 words I cannot. Send those children away, and stay with me.
No, keep your bad tidings to yourself. I know it is something I don't want to hear, and something you would displease me by telling.
You have divined too truly, I fear, but still, since I know it, I feel it my duty to disclose it to you.
Oh, spare us both the infliction, and I will exonerate you from the duty. You have offered to tell, I have refused to hear. My ignorance will not be charged on you.
Be it so. You shall not hear it from me. But if the blow fall too suddenly upon you when it comes, remember, I wished to soften it.
I left him. I was determined his words should not alarm me. What could he, of all men, have to reveal that was of importance for me to hear? It was no doubt some exaggerated tale about my unfortunate husband, that he wished to make the most of to serve his own bad purposes. 6th. He has not alluded to this momentous mystery since, and I have seen no reason to repent of my unwillingness to hear it. The threatened blow has not been struck yet, and I do not greatly fear it. At present I am pleased with Arthur. He has not positively disgraced himself for upwards of a fortnight, and all this last week has been so very moderate in his indulgence at table, that I can perceive a marked difference in his general temper and appearance. Dare I hope this will continue?
End of chapter 32. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
7th. Yes, I will hope. Tonight I heard Grimsby and Hattersley grumbling together about the inhospitality of their host. They did not know I was near, for I happened to be standing behind the curtain in the bow of the window, watching the moon rising over the clump of tall dark elm trees below the lawn, and wondering why Arthur was so sentimental as to stand without, leaning against the outer pillar of the portico, apparently watching it too.
So, I suppose we've seen the last of our merry carousals in this house,
said Mr. Hattersley.
I thought his good fellowship wouldn't last long. But,
added he, laughing,
I didn't expect it would meet its end this way. I rather thought our pretty hostess would be setting up her porcupine quills, and threatening to turn us out of the house if we didn't mind our manners.
You didn't foresee this, then?
answered Grimsby, with a guttural chuckle.
But he'll change again when he's sick of her. If we come here a year or two hence, we shall have all our own way, you'll see.
I don't know,
replied the other.
She's not the style of woman you soon tire of. But be that as it may, it's devilish provoking now that we can't be jolly, because he chooses to be on his good behaviour.
It's all these cursed women,
muttered Grimsby.
Oh, they're the very bane of the world. They bring trouble and discomfort wherever they come, with their false fair faces and their deceitful tongues.
At this juncture I issued from my retreat, and smiling on Mr. Grimsby as I passed, left the room and went out in search of Arthur. Having seen him bend his course towards the shrubbery, I followed him thither, and found him just entering the shadowy walk. I was so light of heart, so overflowing with affection, that I sprang upon him and clasped him in my arms. This startling conduct had a singular effect upon him. First he murmured,
"Bless you, darling,"
and returned my close embrace with a fervour like old times. And then he started, and in a tone of absolute terror exclaimed,
"Helen, what the devil is this?"
And I saw, by the faint light gleaming through the overshadowing tree, that he was positively pale with the shock. How strange that the instinctive impulse of affection should come first, and then the shock of the surprise! It shows, at least, that the affection is genuine. He is not sick of me yet. "I startled you, Arthur," said I, laughing in my glee. "How nervous you are!"
"What the deuce did you do it for?"
cried he, quite testily, extricating himself from my arms, and wiping his forehead with his handkerchief.
"Go back, Helen, go back directly. You'll get your death of cold."
"I won't, till I've told you what I came for. They are blaming you, Arthur, for your temperance and sobriety, and I've come to thank you for it. They say it is all these cursed women, and that we are the bane of the world. But don't let them laugh or grumble you out of your good resolutions, or your affection for me." He laughed. I squeezed him in my arms again, and cried in tearful earnest, "Do, do persevere, and I'll love you better than ever I did before."
"Well, well, I will,"
said he, hastily kissing me.
"There now, go. You mad creature, how could you come out in your light evening dress this chill autumn night?"
"It is a glorious night," said I.
"It is a night that will give you your death in another minute. Run away, do."
"Do you see my death among those trees, Arthur?" said I, for he was gazing intently at the shrubs, as if he saw it coming, and I was reluctant to leave him, in my new-found happiness and revival of hope and love. But he grew angry at my delay, so I kissed him and ran back to the house. I was in such a good humour that night. Millicent told me I was the life of the party, and whispered she had never seen me so brilliant. Certainly I talked enough for 20, and smiled upon them all. Grimsby, Hattersley, Hargrave, Lady Loughborough, all shared my sisterly kindness. Grimsby stared and wondered. Hattersley laughed and jested, in spite of the little wine he had been suffered to imbibe, but still behaved as well as he knew how. Hargrave and Annabella, from different motives and in different ways, emulated me, and doubtless both surpassed me, the former in his discursive versatility and eloquence, the latter in boldness and animation at least. Millicent, delighted to see her husband, her brother, and her overestimated friend acquitting themselves so well, was lively and gay too, in her quiet way. Even Lord Loughborough caught the general contagion. His dark greenish eyes were lighted up beneath their moody brows. His sombre countenance was beautified by smiles. All traces of gloom and proud or cold reserve had vanished for the time, and he astonished us all, not only by his general cheerfulness and animation, but by the positive flashes of true force and brilliance he emitted from time to time. Arthur did not talk much, but he laughed, and listened to the rest, and was in perfect good humour, though not excited by wine. So that altogether we made a very merry, innocent, and entertaining party. 9th. Yesterday, when Rachel came to dress me for dinner, I saw that she had been crying. I wanted to know the cause of it, but she seemed reluctant to tell. Was she unwell? No. Had she heard bad news from her friends? No. Had any of the servants vexed her?
"Oh, no, ma'am,"
she answered.
"It's not for myself."
What then, Rachel? Have you been reading novels?
"Bless you, no,"
said she, with a sorrowful shake of the head, and then she sighed and continued,
"but to tell you the truth, ma'am, I don't like master's ways of going on."
What do you mean, Rachel? He's going on very properly at present.
"Well, ma'am, if you think so, it's right."
And she went on dressing my hair in a hurried way, quite unlike her usual calm, collected manner, murmuring, half to herself, she was sure it was beautiful hair. She
"Could like to see 'em match it."
When it was done, she fondly stroked it, and gently patted my head. "Is that affectionate ebullition intended for my hair or myself, nurse?" said I, laughingly turning round upon her, but a tear was even now in her eye. "What do you mean, Rachel?" I exclaimed.
"Well, ma'am, I don't know, but if—"
"If what?"
"Well, if I was you, I wouldn't have that Lady Lowborough in the house another minute. Not another minute, I wouldn't."
I was thunderstruck, but before I could recover from the shock sufficiently to demand an explanation, Millicent entered my room, as she frequently does when she's dressed before me, and she stayed with me till it was time to go down. She must have found me a very unsociable companion this time, for Rachel's last words rang in my ears. But still I hoped, I trusted, they had no foundation, but in some idle rumour of the servants, from what they had seen in Lady Lowborough's manner last month, or perhaps from something that had passed between their master and her during her former visit. At dinner I narrowly observed both her and Arthur, and saw nothing extraordinary in the conduct of either, nothing calculated to excite suspicion, except in distrustful minds, which mine was not, and therefore I would not suspect. Almost immediately after dinner, Annabella went out with her husband to share his moonlight ramble, for it was a splendid evening like the last. Mr. Hargrave entered the drawing-room a little before the others, and challenged me to a game of chess. He did it without any of that sad but proud humility he usually assumes in addressing me, unless he is excited with wine. I looked at his face to see if that was the case now. His eye met mine keenly, but steadily. There was something about him I did not understand, but he seemed sober enough. Not choosing to engage with him, I referred him to Millicent.
"She plays badly,"
said he.
"I want to match my skill with yours. Come now, you can't pretend you are reluctant to lay down your work. I know you never take it up except to pass an idle hour, when there is nothing better you can do."
"But chess players are so unsociable," I objected. "They are no company for any but themselves."
"There is no one here but Millicent, and she—"
"Oh, I shall be delighted to watch you,"
cried our mutual friend.
"Two such players. It will be quite a treat. I wonder which will conquer."
I consented.
"Now, Mrs. Huntingdon,"
said Hargrave, as he arranged the men on the board, speaking distinctly, and with a peculiar emphasis, as if he had a double meaning to all his words,
"you are a good player, but I am better. We shall have a long game, and you will give me some trouble, but I can be as patient as you, and in the end I shall certainly win."
He fixed his eyes upon me with a glance I did not like, keen, crafty, bold, and almost impudent, already half triumphant in his anticipated success. "I hope not, Mr. Hargrave," returned I, with vehemence that must have startled Millicent at least, but he only smiled and murmured,
"Time will show."
We set to work, he sufficiently interested in the game, but calm and fearless in the consciousness of superior skill. I, intensely eager to disappoint his expectations, for I considered this the type of a more serious contest, as I imagined he did, and I felt an almost superstitious dread of being beaten. At all events, I could ill endure that present success should add one tittle to his conscious power, his insolent self-confidence, I ought to say, or encourage for a moment his dream of future conquest. His play was cautious and deep, but I struggled hard against him. For some time the combat was doubtful. At length, to my joy, the victory seemed inclining to my side. I had taken several of his best pieces, and manifestly baffled his projects. He put his hand to his brow and paused, in evident perplexity. I rejoiced in my advantage, but dared not glory in it yet. At length he lifted his head, and quietly making his move, looked at me and said calmly,
"Now you think you will win, don't you?"
"I hope so," replied I, taking his pawn that he had pushed into the way of my bishop with so careless an air that I thought it was an oversight, but was not generous enough, under the circumstances, to direct his attention to it, and too heedless, at the moment, to foresee the after consequences of my move.
"It is those bishops that trouble me,"
said he,
"but the bold knight can overleap the reverend gentleman.
taking my last bishop with his knight.
And now, those sacred persons once removed, I shall carry all before me."
Oh, Walter, how you talk!
cried Millicent.
She has far more pieces than you still.
I intend to give you some trouble yet, said I, and perhaps, sir, you will find yourself checkmated before you are aware. Look to your queen. The combat deepened. The game was a long one, and I did give him some trouble, but he was a better player than I.
What keen gamesters you are!
said Mr. Hattersley, who had now entered, and been watching us for some time.
Why, Mrs. Huntingdon, your hand trembles as if you had staked your all upon it. And Walter, you dog, you look as deep and cool as if you were certain of success, and as keen and cruel as if you would drain her heart's blood. But if I were you, I wouldn't beat her, for very fear. She'll hate you if you do. She will, by heaven. I see it in her eye.
Hold your tongue, will you? said I. His talk distracted me, for I was driven to extremities. A few more moves, and I was inextricably entangled in the snare of my antagonist.
"Check."
cried he. I sought in agony some means of escape.
"Mate,"
he added quietly, but with evident delight. He had suspended the utterance of that last fatal syllable, the better to enjoy my dismay. I was foolishly disconcerted by the event. Hattersley laughed. Millicent was troubled to see me so disturbed. Hargrave placed his hand on mine that rested on the table, and squeezing it with a firm but gentle pressure, murmured,
"Beaten, beaten,"
and gazed into my face with a look where exultation was blended with an expression of ardour and tenderness yet more insulting. "No, never, Mr. Hargrave!" exclaimed I, quickly withdrawing my hand.
"Do you deny?"
replied he, smilingly pointing to the board. "No, no," I answered, recollecting how strange my conduct must appear. "You have beaten me in that game."
"Will you try another, then?"
"No."
"You acknowledge my superiority?"
"Yes, as a chess player." I rose to resume my work.
"Where is Annabella?"
said Hargrave gravely, after glancing round the room. "Gone out with Lord Loughborough," answered I, for he looked at me for a reply.
"And not yet returned?"
he said seriously. "I suppose not."
"Where is Huntingdon?"
looking round again.
Gone out with Grimsby, as you know,"
said Hattersley, suppressing a laugh, which broke forth as he concluded the sentence. Why did he laugh? Why did Hargrave connect them thus together? Was it true, then? And was this the dreadful secret he had wished to reveal to me? I must know, and that quickly. I instantly rose and left the room to go in search of Rachel, and demand an explanation of her words. But Mr. Hargrave followed me into the anteroom, and before I could open its outer door, gently laid his hand upon the lock.
"May I tell you something, Mrs. Huntingdon?"
said he, in a subdued tone, with serious downcast eyes. "If it be anything worth hearing," replied I, struggling to be composed, for I trembled in every limb. He quietly pushed a chair towards me. I merely leant my hand upon it, and bid him go on.
"Do not be alarmed,"
said he.
"What I wish to say is nothing in itself, and I will leave you to draw your own inferences from it. You say that Annabella is not yet returned."
"Yes, yes, go on," said I, impatiently, for I feared my forced calmness would leave me before the end of his disclosure, whatever it might be.
"And you hear,"
continued he,
"that Huntingdon is gone out with Grimsby?"
"Well?"
"I heard the latter say to your husband, or the man who calls himself so—"
"Go on, sir." He bowed submissively, and continued,
"I heard him say, 'I shall manage it, you'll see. They're gone down by the water. I shall meet them there, and tell him I want a bit of talk with him, about some things that we needn't trouble the lady with. And she'll say she can be walking back to the house. And then I shall apologise, you know, and all that, and tip her a wink to take the way of the shrubbery. I'll keep him talking there about those matters I mentioned, and anything else I can think of, as long as I can, and then bring him round the other way, stopping to look at the trees, the fields, and anything else I can find to discourse of."
Mr. Hargrave paused and looked at me. Without a word of comment or further questioning, I rose, and darted from the room and out of the house. The torment of suspense was not to be endured. I would not suspect my husband falsely, on this man's accusation, and I would not trust him unworthily. I must know the truth at once. I flew to the shrubbery. Scarcely had I reached it, when a sound of voices arrested my breathless speed.
"We have lingered too long. He will be back,"
said Lady Loughborough's voice.
"Surely not, dearest,"
was his reply.
"but you can run across the lawn, and get in as quietly as you can. I'll follow in a while."
My knees trembled under me. My brain swam round. I was ready to faint. She must not see me thus. I shrunk among the bushes, and leant against the trunk of a tree to let her pass.
"Ah, Huntingdon,"
said she reproachfully, pausing where I had stood with him the night before.
"it was here you kissed that woman."
She looked back into the leafy shade. Advancing thence, he answered, with a careless laugh.
"Well, dearest, I couldn't help it. You know I must keep straight with her as long as I can. Haven't I seen you kiss your dolt of a husband scores of times, and do I ever complain?"
"But tell me, don't you love her still? A little?"
said she, placing her hand on his arm, looking earnestly in his face, for I could see them plainly, the moon shining full upon them from between the branches of the tree that sheltered me.
"Not one bit, by all that's sacred,"
he replied, kissing her glowing cheek.
"Good heavens, I must be gone!"
cried she, suddenly breaking from him, and away she flew. There he stood before me, but I had not strength to confront him now. My tongue cleaved to the roof of my mouth. I was well nigh sinking to the earth, and I almost wondered he did not hear the beating of my heart above the low sighing of the wind and the fitful rustle of the falling leaves. My senses seemed to fail me, but still I saw his shadowy form pass before me, and through the rushing sound in my ears I distinctly heard him say, as he stood looking up the lawn,
"There goes the fool. Run, Annabella, run. There, in with you. Ah, he didn't see. That's right, Grimsby, keep him back."
And even his low laugh reached me as he walked away. "God help me now," I murmured, sinking on my knees among the damp weeds and brushwood that surrounded me, and looking up at the moonlit sky through the scant foliage above. It seemed all dim and quivering now to my darkened sight. My burning, bursting heart strove to pour forth its agony to God, but could not frame its anguish into prayer, until a gust of wind swept over me, which, while it scattered the dead leaves, like blighted hopes, around, cooled my forehead, and seemed a little to revive my sinking frame. Then, while I lifted up my soul in speechless, earnest supplication, some heavenly influence seemed to strengthen me within. I breathed more freely, my vision cleared. I saw distinctly the pure moon shining on, and the light clouds skimming the clear, dark sky. And then I saw the eternal stars twinkling down upon me. I knew their God was mine, and he was strong to save and swift to hear. "I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee," seemed whispered from above their myriad orbs. No, no, I felt he would not leave me comfortless. In spite of earth and hell I should have strength for all my trials, and win a glorious rest at last. Refreshed, invigorated, if not composed, I rose and returned to the house. Much of my new-born strength and courage forsook me, I confess, as I entered it, and shut out the fresh wind and the glorious sky. Everything I saw and heard seemed to sicken my heart. The hall, the lamp, the staircase, the doors of the different apartments, the social sound of talk and laughter from the drawing-room. How could I bear my future life? In this house, among those people? Oh, how could I endure to live? John just then entered the hall, and seeing me, told me he had been sent in search of me, adding that he had taken in the tea, and master wished to know if I were coming. "Ask Mrs. Hattersley to be so kind as to make the tea, John," said I. "Say I am not well to-night, and wish to be excused." I retired into the large empty dining-room, where all was silence and darkness, but for the soft sighing of the wind without, and the faint gleam of moonlight that pierced the blinds and curtains. And there I walked rapidly up and down, thinking of my bitter thoughts alone. How different was this from the evening of yesterday! That, it seems, was the last expiring flash of my life's happiness. Poor blinded fool that I was to be so happy! I could now see the reason of Arthur's strange reception of me in the shrubbery. The burst of kindness was for his paramour, the start of horror for his wife. Now, too, I could better understand the conversation between Hattersley and Grimsby. It was doubtless of his love for her they spoke, not for me. I heard the drawing-room door open. A light, quick step came out of the anteroom, crossed the hall, and ascended the stairs. It was Millicent, poor Millicent, gone to see how I was. No one else cared for me, but she still was kind. I shed no tears before, but now they came, fast and free. Thus she did me good, without approaching me. Disappointed in her search, I heard her come down, more slowly than she had ascended. Would she come in there, and find me out? No, she turned in the opposite direction, and re-entered the drawing-room. I was glad, for I knew not how to meet her, or what to say. I wanted no confidant in my distress. I deserved none, and I wanted none. I had taken the burden upon myself. Let me bear it alone. As the usual hour of retirement approached, I dried my eyes, and tried to clear my voice and calm my mind. I must see Arthur tonight, and speak to him. But I would do it calmly. There should be no scene. Nothing to complain or to boast of to his companions. Nothing to laugh at with his lady love. When the company were retiring to their chambers, I gently opened the door, and just as he passed, beckoned him in.
"What to do with you, Helen?"
said he.
"Why couldn't you come to make tea for us? And what the deuce are you doing here for in the dark? What ails you, young woman? You look like a ghost,"
he continued, surveying me by the light of his candle. "No matter," I answered, "to you. You have no longer any regard for me, it appears, and I have no longer any for you."
"Hullo, what the devil is this?"
he muttered. "I would leave you to-morrow," continued I, "and never again come under this roof, but for my child." I paused a moment to steady my voice.
"What in the devil's name is this, Helen?"
cried he.
"What can you be driving at?"
"You know perfectly well. Let us waste no time in useless explanation. But tell me, will you?" He vehemently swore he knew nothing about it, and insisted upon hearing what poisonous old woman had been blackening his name, and what infamous lies I had been fool enough to believe. "Spare yourself the trouble of forswearing yourself, and racking your brains to stifle truth with falsehood," I coldly replied. "I have trusted to the testimony of no third person. I was in the shrubbery this evening, and I saw and heard for myself." This was enough. He uttered a suppressed exclamation of consternation and dismay, and muttering,
"I shall catch it now,"
set down his candle on the nearest chair, and rearing his back against the wall, stood confronting me with folded arms.
"Well, what then?"
said he, with a calm insolence of mingled shamelessness and desperation. "Only this," returned I. "Will you let me take our child, and what remains of my fortune, and go?"
"Go where?"
"Anywhere, where he will be safe from your contaminating influence, and I shall be delivered from your presence, and you from mine."
"No."
"Will you let me have the child, then, without the money?"
"No, nor yourself without the child. Do you think I'm going to be made the talk of the county for your fastidious caprices?"
"Then I must stay here, to be hated and despised. But henceforth we are husband and wife only in the name."
"Very good."
"I am your child's mother, and your housekeeper, nothing more. So you need not trouble yourself any longer to feign the love you cannot feel. I will exact no more heartless caresses from you, nor offer nor endure them either. I will not be mocked with the empty husk of conjugal endearments, when you have given the substance to another."
"Very good, if you please. We shall see who will tire first, my lady."
"If I tire, it will be of living in the world with you, not of living without your mockery of love. When you tire of your sinful ways, and show yourself truly repentant, I will forgive you, and, perhaps, try to love you again, though that will be hard indeed."
"Humph. And meantime you will go and talk me over to Mrs. Hargrave, and write long letters to Aunt Maxwell to complain of the wicked wretch you have married?"
"I shall complain to no one. Hitherto I have struggled hard to hide your vices from every eye, and invest you with virtues you never possessed. But now you must look to yourself." I left him muttering bad language to himself, and went upstairs.
"You are poorly, ma'am,"
said Rachel, surveying me with deep anxiety. "It is too true, Rachel," said I, answering her sad looks rather than her words.
"I knew it, or I wouldn't have mentioned such a thing."
"But don't you trouble yourself about it," said I, kissing her pale, time-wasted cheek. "I can bear it better than you imagine."
"Yes, you were always forbearing. But if I was you, I wouldn't bear it. I'd give way to it and cry right hard. And I'd talk, too. I just would. I'd let him know what it was to."
"I have talked," said I. "I've said enough."
"Then I'd cry,"
persisted she.
"I wouldn't look so white and so calm and burst my heart with keeping it in."
"I have cried," said I, smiling, in spite of my misery. and I am calm now, really. So don't discompose me again, nurse. Let us say no more about it, and don't mention it to the servants. There, you may go now. Good night, and don't disturb your rest for me. I shall sleep well, if I can." Notwithstanding this resolution, I found my bed so intolerable that before 2 o'clock I rose, and lighting my candle by the rushlight that was still burning, I got my desk and sat down in my dressing gown to recount the events of the past evening. It was better to be so occupied than to be lying in bed, torturing my brain with recollections of the far past and anticipations of the dreadful future. I have found relief in describing the very circumstances that have destroyed my peace, as well as the little trivial details attendant upon their discovery. No sleep I could have got this night would have done so much towards composing my mind, and preparing me to meet the trials of the day. I fancy so, at least, and yet, when I cease writing, I find my head aches terribly, and when I look into the glass, I am startled at my haggard, worn appearance. Rachel has been to dress me, and says I have had a sad night of it, she can see. Millicent has just looked in to ask me how I was. I told her I was better, but to excuse my appearance, admitted I had had a restless night. I wish this day were over. I shudder at the thoughts of going down to breakfast. How shall I encounter them all? Yet let me remember, it is not I that am guilty. I have no cause to fear, and if they scorn me as a victim of their guilt, I can pity their folly and despise their scorn.
End of chapter 33. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Evening. Breakfast passed well over. I was calm and cool throughout. I answered composedly all inquiries respecting my health, and whatever was unusual in my look or manner was generally attributed to the trifling indisposition that had occasioned my early retirement last night. But how am I to get over the 10 or 12 days that must yet elapse before they go? Yet why so long for their departure? When they are gone, how shall I get through the months or years of my future life in company with that man, my greatest enemy? For none could injure me as he has done. Oh, when I think how fondly, how foolishly I have loved him, how madly I have trusted him, how constantly I have labored, and studied, and prayed, and struggled for his advantage, and how cruelly he has trampled on my love, betrayed my trust, scorned my prayers and tears, and efforts for his preservation, crushed my hopes, destroyed my youth's best feelings, and doomed me to a life of hopeless misery as far as man can do it. It is not enough to say that I no longer love my husband. I hate him. The word stares me in the face like a guilty confession, but it is true. I hate him. I hate him. But God have mercy on his miserable soul, and make him see and feel his guilt. I ask no other vengeance. If he could but fully know and truly feel my wrongs, I should be well avenged, and I could freely pardon all. But he is so lost, so hardened in his heartless depravity, that in this life I believe he never will. But it is useless dwelling on this theme. Let me seek once more to dissipate reflection in the minor details of passing events. Mr. Hargrave has annoyed me all day long with his serious, sympathizing, and, as he thinks, unobtrusive politeness. If it were more obtrusive it would trouble me less, for then I could snub him. But, as it is, he contrives to appear so really kind and thoughtful that I cannot do so without rudeness and seeming ingratitude. I sometimes think I ought to give him credit for the good feeling he simulates so well, and then again I think it is my duty to suspect him under the peculiar circumstances in which I am placed. His kindness may not all be feigned, but still, let not the purest impulse of gratitude to him induce me to forget myself. Let me remember the game of chess, the expressions he used on the occasion, and those indescribable looks of his, that so justly roused my indignation, and I think I shall be safe enough. I have done well to record them so minutely. I think he wishes to find an opportunity of speaking to me alone. He has seemed to be on the watch all day, but I have taken care to disappoint him. Not that I fear anything he could say, but I have trouble enough without the addition of his insulting consolations, condolences, or whatever else he might attempt. And, for Millicent's sake, I do not wish to quarrel with him. He excused himself from going out to shoot with the other gentlemen in the morning, under the pretext of having letters to write, and instead of retiring for that purpose into the library, He sent for his desk into the morning-room, where I was seated with Millicent and Lady Loughborough. They had betaken themselves to their work. I, less to divert my mind than to deprecate conversation, had provided myself with a book. Millicent saw that I wished to be quiet, and accordingly let me alone. Annabella doubtless saw it too, but that was no reason why she should restrain her tongue, or curb her cheerful spirits. She accordingly chatted away, addressing herself almost exclusively to me, and with the utmost assurance and familiarity, growing the more animated and friendly the colder and briefer my answers became. Mr. Hargrave saw that I could ill endure it, and looking up from his desk, he answered her questions and observations for me, as far as he could, and attempted to transfer her social attentions from me to himself, but it would not do. Perhaps she thought I had a headache, and could not bear to talk. At any rate, she saw that her loquacious vivacity annoyed me, as I could tell by the malicious pertinacity with which she persisted, but I checked it effectually by putting into her hand the book I had been trying to read, on the fly-leaf of which I had hastily scribbled, "I am too well acquainted with your character and conduct to feel any real friendship for you, and as I am without your talent for dissimulation, I cannot assume the appearance of it. I must therefore beg that hereafter all familiar intercourse may cease between us, and if I shall continue to treat you with civility, as if you were a woman worthy of consideration and respect, understand that it is out of regard for your cousin Millicent's feelings, not for yours." Upon perusing this she turned scarlet and bit her lip. Covertly tearing away the leaf, she crumpled it up and put it in the fire, and then employed herself in turning over the pages of the book, and, really or apparently, perusing its contents. In a little while Millicent announced it her intention to repair to the nursery, and asked if I would accompany her.
"Annabella will excuse us,"
said she.
"She's busy reading."
"No, I won't,"
cried Annabella, suddenly looking up and throwing her book on the table.
"I want to speak to Helen a minute. You may go, Millicent, and she'll follow in a while."
Millicent went.
"Will you oblige me, Helen?"
continued she. Her impudence astounded me, but I complied, and followed her into the library. She closed the door and walked up to the fire.
"Who told you this?"
said she. "No one. I am not incapable of seeing for myself."
"Ah, you are suspicious,"
cried she, smiling, with a gleam of hope. Hitherto there had been a kind of desperation in her hardihood. Now she was evidently relieved. "If I were suspicious," I replied, "I should have discovered your infamy long before. No, Lady Loughborough, I do not found my charge upon suspicion."
"On what do you found it, then?"
said she, throwing herself into an armchair, and stretching out her feet to the fender, with an obvious effort to appear composed. "I enjoy a moonlight ramble as well as you," I answered, steadily fixing my eyes upon her, "and the shrubbery happens to be one of my favourite resorts." She coloured again excessively, and remained silent, pressing her finger against her teeth, and gazing into the fire. I watched her a few moments, with a feeling of malevolent gratification. Then, moving towards the door, I calmly asked if she had anything more to say.
"Yes, yes,"
cried she eagerly, starting up from her reclining posture.
"I want to know if you will tell Lord Loughborough."
"Suppose I do?"
"Well, if you are disposed to publish the matter, I cannot dissuade you, of course. But there will be terrible work if you do. And if you don't, I shall think you the most generous of mortal beings. And if there is anything in the world I can do for you, anything short of—"
She hesitated. "Short of renouncing your guilty connection with my husband, I suppose you mean?" said I. She paused, in evident disconcertion and perplexity, mingled with anger she dared not show.
"I cannot renounce what is dearer than life,"
she muttered, in a low, hurried tone. Then, suddenly raising her head, and fixing her gleaming eyes upon me, she continued earnestly,
"But Helen, or Mrs. Huntingdon, or whatever you would have me call you, will you tell him? If you are generous, here is a fitting opportunity for the exercise of your magnanimity. If you are proud, here am I, your rival, ready to acknowledge myself your debtor for an act of the most noble forbearance."
"I shall not tell him."
"You will not?"
cried she delightedly.
"Accept my sincere thanks, then."
She sprang up and offered me her hand. I drew back. "Give me no thanks. It is not for your sake that I refrain. Neither is it an act of any forbearance. I have no wish to publish your shame. I should be sorry to distress your husband with the knowledge of it."
"And Millicent? Will you tell her?"
"No. On the contrary, I shall do my utmost to conceal it from her. I would not for much that she should know the infamy and disgrace of her relation."
You use hard words, Mrs. Huntingdon, but I can pardon you.
And now, Lady Loughborough, continued I, let me counsel you to leave this house as soon as possible. You must be aware that your continuance here is excessively disagreeable to me. Not for Mr. Huntingdon's sake, said I, observing the dawn of a malicious smile of triumph on her face. You are welcome to him, if you like him, as far as I am concerned, but because it is painful to be always disguising my true sentiments respecting you, and straining to keep up an appearance of civility and respect towards one for whom I have not the most distant shadow of esteem, and because, if you stay, your conduct cannot possibly remain concealed much longer from the only two persons in the house who do not know it already. And, for your husband's sake, Annabella, and even for your own, I earnestly advise and entreat you to break off this unlawful connection at once, and return to your duty while you may, before the dreadful consequences.
Yes, yes, of course,
said she, interrupting me with a gesture of impatience.
But I cannot go, Helen, before the time appointed for our departure. What possible pretext could I frame for such a thing? Whether I proposed going back alone, which Loughborough would not hear of, or taking him with me, the very circumstance itself would be certain to excite suspicion. And when our visit is so nearly at an end, too, little more than a week, surely you can endure my presence so long. I will not annoy you with any more of my friendly impertinences.
Well, I have nothing more to say to you.
Have you mentioned this affair to Huntingdon?
Asked she, as I was leaving the room. How dare you mention his name to me? Was the only answer I gave. No words have passed between us since, but such as outward decency or pure necessity demanded.
End of chapter 34. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
19th. In proportion as Lady Loughborough finds she has nothing to fear from me, and as the time of departure draws nigh, the more audacious and insolent she becomes. She does not scruple to speak to my husband with affectionate familiarity in my presence, when no one else is by, and is particularly fond of displaying her interest in his health and welfare, or in anything that concerns him, as if for the purpose of contrasting her kind solitude with my cold indifference. And he rewards her by such smiles and glances, such whispered words, or boldly spoken insinuations, indicative of his sense of her goodness and my neglect, as make the blood rush into my face, in spite of myself, for I would be utterly regardless of it all, deaf and blind to everything that passes between them, since the more I show myself sensible of their wickedness, the more she triumphs in her victory, and the more he flatters himself that I love him devotedly still, in spite of my pretended indifference. On such occasions I have sometimes been startled by a subtle, fiendish suggestion, inciting me to show him the contrary by a seeming encouragement of Hargrave's advances. But such ideas are banished in a moment with horror and self-abasement, and then I hate him tenfold more than ever for having brought me to this. God pardon me for it and all my sinful thoughts. Instead of being humbled and purified by my afflictions, I feel that they are turning my nature into gall. This must be my fault as much as theirs that wrong me. No true Christian could cherish such bitter feelings as I do against him and her, especially the latter. Him I still feel that I could pardon, freely, gladly, on the slightest token of repentance. But she, words cannot utter my abhorrence. Reason forbids, but passion urges strongly, and I must pray and struggle long ere I subdue it. It is well that she is leaving to-morrow, for I could not well endure her presence for another day. This morning she rose earlier than usual. I found her in the room alone when I went down to breakfast.
"Oh, Helen, is it you?"
said she, turning as I entered. I gave an involuntary start back on seeing her, at which she uttered a short laugh, observing,
"I think we are both disappointed."
I came forward and busied myself with the breakfast things.
"This is the last day I shall burden your hospitality,"
said she, as she seated herself at the table.
"Ah, here comes one that will not rejoice at it,"
she murmured, half to herself, as Arthur entered the room. He shook hands with her, and wished her good morning. Then, looking lovingly in her face, and still retaining her hand in his, murmured pathetically,
"The last day."
"Yes,"
said she, with some asperity.
"And I rose early to make the best of it. I have been here alone this half-hour, and you lazy creature."
"Well, I thought I was early too,"
said he,
"but—"
dropping his voice almost to a whisper,
"you see we are not alone."
"We never are,"
returned she, but they were almost as good as alone, for I was now standing at the window, watching the clouds, and struggling to suppress my wrath. Some more words passed between them, which, happily, I did not overhear, but Annabella had the audacity to come and place herself beside me, and even to put her hand upon my shoulder, and say softly,
"You need not grudge him to me, Helen, for I love him more than ever you could do."
This put me beside myself. I took her hand and violently dashed it from me, with an expression of abhorrence and indignation that could not be suppressed. Startled, almost appalled, by this sudden outbreak, she recoiled in silence. I would have given way to my fury, and said more, but Arthur's low laugh recalled me to myself. I checked the half-uttered invective, and scornfully turned away, regretting that I had given him so much amusement. He was still laughing when Mr. Hargrave made his appearance. How much of the scene he had witnessed I do not know, for the door was ajar when he entered. He greeted his host and his cousin both coldly, and me with a glance intended to express the deepest sympathy, mingled with high admiration and esteem.
"How much allegiance do you owe to that man?"
he asked below his breath, as he stood beside me at the window, affecting to be making observations on the weather. "None," I answered, and immediately returning to the table, I employed myself in making the tea. He followed, and would have entered into some kind of conversation with me, but the other guests were now beginning to assemble, and I took no more notice of him, except to give him his coffee. After breakfast, determined to pass as little of the day as possible in company with Lady Loughborough, I quietly stole away from the company, and retired to the library. Mr. Hargrave followed me thither, under pretence of coming for a book, and first, turning to the shelves, he selected a volume, and then quietly, but by no means timidly, approaching me, he stood beside me, resting his hand on the back of my chair, and said softly,
"And so you consider yourself free at last?"
"Yes," said I, without moving, or raising my eyes from my book. "Free to do anything but offend God and my conscience." There was a momentary pause.
"Very right,"
said he,
"provided your conscience be not too morbidly tender, and your ideas of God not too erroneously severe. But can you suppose it would offend that benevolent being to make the happiness of one who would die for yours, to raise a devoted heart from purgatorial torments to a state of heavenly bliss, when you could do it without the slightest injury to yourself or any other?"
This was spoken in a low, earnest, melting tone, as he bent over me. I now raised my head, and steadily confronting his gaze, I answered calmly, "Mr. Hargrave, do you mean to insult me?" He was not prepared for this. He paused a moment to recover the shock. Then, drawing himself up, and removing his hand from my chair, he answered, with proud sadness,
"That was not my intention."
I just glanced towards the door, with a slight movement of the head, and then returned to my book. He immediately withdrew. This was better than if I had answered with more words, and in the passionate spirit to which my first impulse would have prompted. What a good thing it is to be able to command one's temper! I must labour to cultivate this inestimable quality. God only knows how often I shall need it in this rough, dark road that lies before me. In the course of the morning, I drove over to the Grove with the two ladies, to give Millicent an opportunity for bidding farewell to her mother and sister. They persuaded her to stay with them the rest of the day, Mrs. Hargrave promising to bring her back in the evening, and remain till the party broke up on the morrow. Consequently, Lady Loughborough and I had the pleasure of returning tête-à-tête in the carriage together. For the first mile or two we kept silence, I looking out of my window, and she leaning back in her corner. But I was not going to restrict myself to any particular position for her. When I was tired of leaning forward, with the cold raw wind in my face, and surveying the russet hedges and the damp tangled grass of their banks, I gave it up and leant back too. With her usual impudence, my companion then made some attempts to get up a conversation, but the monosyllables yes, or no, or were the utmost her several remarks could elicit from me. At last, on her asking my opinion upon some immaterial point of discussion, I answered, "Why do you wish to talk to me, Lady Loughborough? You must know what I think of you."
"Well, if you will be so bitter against me,"
replied she,
"I can't help it. But I'm not going to sulk for anybody."
Our short drive was now at an end. As soon as the carriage door was opened, she sprang out, and went down the park to meet the gentlemen, who were just returning from the woods. Of course I did not follow. But I had not done with her impudence yet. After dinner I retired to the drawing-room, as usual, and she accompanied me, but I had the two children with me, and I gave them my whole attention, and determined to keep them till the gentlemen came, or till Millicent arrived with her mother. Little Helen, however, was soon tired of playing, and insisted upon going to sleep; and while I sat on the sofa with her on my knee, and Arthur seated beside me, gently playing with her soft flaxen hair, Lady Loughborough composedly came and placed herself on the other side.
"To-morrow, Mrs. Huntingdon," said
she,
"you will be delivered from my presence, which, no doubt, you will be very glad of. It is natural you should. But do you know I have rendered you a great service? Shall I tell you what it is?"
"I shall be glad to hear of any service you have rendered me," said I, determined to be calm, for I knew by the tone of her voice she wanted to provoke me.
"Well,"
resumed she,
"have you not observed the salutary change in Mr. Huntingdon? Don't you see what a sober, temperate man he has become? You saw with regret the sad habits he was contracting, I know, and I know you did your utmost to deliver him from them, but without success, until I came to your assistance. I told him in a few words that I could not bear to see him degrade himself so, and that I should cease to— no matter what I told him, but you see the reformation I have wrought, and you ought to thank me for it."
I rose and rang for the nurse.
"But I desire no thanks,"
she continued.
"All the return I ask is, that you will take care of him when I am gone, and not, by harshness and neglect, drive him back to his old courses."
I was almost sick with passion, but Rachel was now at the door. I pointed to the children, for I could not trust myself to speak. She took them away, and I followed.
"Will you, Helen?"
continued the speaker. I gave her a look that blighted the malicious smile on her face, or checked it at least for a moment, and departed. In the anteroom I met Mr. Hargrave. He saw I was in no humour to be spoken to, and suffered me to pass without a word. But when, after a few minutes' seclusion in the library, I had regained my composure, and was returning to join Mrs. Hargrave and Millicent, whom I had just heard come downstairs and go into the drawing-room, I found him there still lingering in the dimly lighted apartment, and evidently waiting for me.
"Mrs. Huntingdon,"
said he as I passed,
"will you allow me one word?"
"What is it, then? Be quick, if you please."
"I offended you this morning, and I cannot live under your displeasure."
"Then go, and sin no more," replied I, turning away.
"No, no,"
said he hastily, setting himself before me.
"Pardon me, but I must have your forgiveness. I leave you to-morrow, and I may not have an opportunity of speaking to you again. I was wrong to forget myself and you as I did. But let me implore you to forget and forgive my rash presumption, and think of me as if those words had never been spoken. For, believe me, I regret them deeply, and the loss of your esteem is too severe a penalty. I cannot bear it."
Forgetfulness is not to be purchased with a wish, and I cannot bestow my esteem on all who desire it, unless they deserve it too.
"I shall think my life well spent in labouring to deserve it, if you will but pardon this offence. Will you?"
"Yes."
"Yes, but that is coldly spoken. Give me your hand, and I'll believe you. You won't? Then, Mrs. Huntingdon, you do not forgive me."
"Yes, here it is, and my forgiveness with it. Only sin no more." He pressed my cold hand with sentimental fervour, but said nothing, and stood aside to let me pass into the room, where all the company were now assembled. Mr. Grimsby was seated near the door. On seeing me enter, almost immediately followed by Hargrave, he leered at me with a glance of intolerable significance as I passed. I looked him in the face till he sullenly turned away, if not ashamed, at least confounded for the moment. Meantime, Hattersley had seized Hargrave by the arm, and was whispering something in his ear, some coarse joke, no doubt, for the latter neither laughed nor spoke in answer, but, turning from him with a slight curl of the lip, disengaged himself and went to his mother, who was telling Lord Loughborough how many reasons she had to be proud of her son. Thank heaven they are all going to-morrow.
Chapter 35